Oh, that's fine. Right now, we have 3 panelists from the Political Science Department. They're going to be talking to us today about the 2016 election. I'm really excited about it. I hope you guys are too. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a bit further and get started.
I'm Joe Romance from the Political Science Department, and I teach American politics and political theory.
I'm Larry Gould from Political Science, obviously, and let's see. I teach primarily international relations, current political issues, those kinds of things.
Leland Cox, also in the Political Science Department, and I teach a lot of public policy and administration.
Well, I'm going to start, and I have a few prepared comments. Whenever I'm asked to talk about any election, one of the first things I start with is what factors make this election look like other elections? And how is this election, whatever election it is, look different? Right? So I'm just going to talk briefly about those things, and I'll also talk about what to look for in the next couple of days on election day. First of all, what factors are similar to previous elections? Well, the first thing I'd say is that, at least for the past 20 years, there's been a fair, not just a fair amount, a great deal of polarization. Okay, we're polarized between Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives, and this election seems to be no different from that. Although I'd say it's mostly, it's maybe more about the party's partisan identification than strong ideology, and we can talk about that more later. I don't know if my colleagues will talk about that. You know, for instance, Trump is not a real strong conservative, but certainly the tribal identification with being a Republican and Democrat is as strong as ever. And in fact, it's probably extremely strong. Secondly, another factor that's alike is we have one very typical candidate, Hillary Clinton. Well, she's untypical in one way. She's a woman, right? But she's not unique in being a career politician. She has a long and distinguished career as First Lady, you all know this stuff, but First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State. And she is well established within the Democratic Party, and her views are well within the bounds of mainstream liberal Democratic thought. So she looks like a typical candidate, with the big exception that she's a woman, and she's gotten this far. I was going to come back to that in a minute. But she looks like a normal candidate in a lot of ways. There's one traditional campaign, all right? Her campaign looks like the campaign you'd expect to be run by a traditional candidate. She's raising money the way you normally would. She's campaigning in the states you'd expect Democrats to campaign in. She's got a very extremely impressive and powerful campaign organization. And the Democrats are doing their normal things with get out the vote. Sometimes that's abbreviated to GOTV, get out the vote. Okay? And finally, the other same thing about this campaign is the electoral map looks largely the same as it has in recent elections. The blue states, the Northeast and the West Coast, are still blue. Okay? The red states, which is the Midwest, well, parts of the Midwest, the West, well, although that's changing a little bit with Colorado and New Mexico, and the South. And then your traditional swing states. And we could talk about those, but you know, there's Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Nevada, to a lesser degree Colorado. I'm trying to think what else the swing states are. But you know, what's that? Arizona. But so these states have been swing states before, and then Arizona, which may be a new swing state, is one that we've kind of been expecting to become a swing state for demographic reasons. So even though it's kind of a new swing state, it's kind of been waiting in the wings, so to speak, as a possibility. So that all looks very normal and well within traditional bounds. Of course, many of you might be wondering, particularly if this is your first serious election to follow, is okay, wow, I thought this is not normal, or this is a weird election. Well, any of the reasons, and they're kind of obvious. What's not normal about this? Well, first of all, first thing is what I talked about. We have a female candidate gotten this far. That has never happened before. Okay? In fact, there's never been a female candidate who's been nominated by one of the major parties. Right? Secondly, we have 2 very unpopular candidates. That's actually very uncommon. The pollsters have been asking this question for years and years. And do you like or dislike the candidate? And there have been some candidates that have been very popular, some candidates have been unpopular, but if you just take how many people think have some positive notion of a candidate, some negative notion, and then you subtract them, the negative from the positive, you get on all previous elections with one, you get a positive number. Bob Dole was slightly more unpopular in 1996 than he was popular, and only by like a percentage point. Okay? We have two candidates who are, as they say, underwater. They have substantially more people dislike them than like them. Right? Hillary is the most unpopular candidate to ever run for president of the United States by that measure, except for one, Donald Trump, who was even more unpopular. The second thing is we have a very untraditional candidate, right? Donald Trump. He has no political experience in elected office. His experience is business and TV, right? And the only other kind of untraditional candidates the only other non-political candidates we've had for president that I can think of that have no elected experience are generals. Okay. Okay, but not of a major party.
Yeah.
Okay. Ross Perot was a significant third-party candidate. He had that experience in 1992. But we've had generals in the 19th century and Eisenhower in the 20th, right? And trust me, rising to high rank in the military means you understand politics, all right? And you've been trained for it in its own military way. And Donald Trump is also running a very unique campaign. He is not doing a lot of his get out the vote organization. His organization itself is extremely small and weak. He's campaigning almost by gut, right? They just started dumping money in Pennsylvania. He's campaigning in various states that most people think he doesn't have a shot at. I mean, if this were a traditional campaign, I just read a day or two ago, I just read a Republican campaign advisor who, when asked about the campaign, the Trump campaign, just threw up his shoulders and said, well, I gather, I just read it, but I heard the shoulders moving up and down in the article. And saying, I just don't know what's going on. If I were his advisor, I'd plant him in Florida and North Carolina and Ohio every single day for the next week. And Trump is in all sorts of odd places. It seems to be that he just goes by gut, or wherever his golf courses are. So that's my take on what's like and unlike this campaign. Two final things, very briefly. What to look for the next week? Well. How does this email story, which maybe we'll talk about more detail, but I just want to let my other colleagues speak in a few minutes. Does it have legs? You all know about the email story that came out over last Friday over the weekend. And now we have one emerging about Trump and there's somebody in the Trump campaign or Trump and connections to Russia. Look to see, if you're really interested in the details, look to see where they are campaigning. Like, where do you see Hillary and Trump in the final days? All right. And also, if you really go into it, where are they spending money? For instance, one interesting thing I just read about just last night, the Hillary campaign dumped $2 million into Wisconsin. That's either a sign they're scared of Wisconsin slipping away, which would be bad news for them. Or there's also a Senate race there. Maybe they're trying to boost their numbers in Wisconsin to get Russ Feingold elected. Well, we don't know. And then on Election Day, just to give you a little hint to look for, obviously, you hear about the early states on the East Coast and stuff. Well, different states have different closing times. Kentucky and Indiana always close their polls very early. Those are both red states, Republican states. Trump's going to win them. But look how quickly, all right, the pundits and the people on the major networks call those states. If there's any sign of, if Trump gets them right away, that's just normal. That's not either a good or bad sign. But if they're waiting and not calling one of those states, it doesn't mean he's going to lose them, but that means the votes are closer than they expected. And of course, the one East Coast state, obviously there's Florida, but Florida has the panhandle and everything. I mean, one state to look for is North Carolina. Who wins it? How long does it take to call that state? If they call it early for one of the two candidates, that's a good sign for them. More likely what we're expecting is that it'll be called kind of later, even though it's on the East Coast. It's probably going to be a close race, so they may not call it to lots of states in the middle of the country have already been called that are more going to go one or the other. But if Hillary wins North Carolina pretty early in the evening, it's probably good. It could just be a unique case in North Carolina. States don't necessarily all move together, but it could be a good sign. And of course, if Trump wins it early, it's a good sign for him. Although he needs to win that state. there's lots of paths Hillary has to victory in the Electoral College. She kind of wants North Carolina, but it'll be very unnerving if she loses it for them. They'll be very worried in Hillary land. But it's not essential. It's essential for Trump, along with Florida, along with all these states. His path is very narrow. And I'll let my colleagues now talk about other things. I hope I haven't stolen any thunder.
One of the things I wanted to bring up that was very unusual about this campaign has been the traditional Republican bases frequently had lukewarm, if at all, endorsements of Trump. Like, for example, a number of newspapers that for decades, if not centuries,
If not their entire history.
yeah, endorsed, Republicans endorsed either Secretary Clinton or Gary Johnson. And so, again, that does point out what Dr. Romance was pointing out, that Trump is not a traditional Republican candidate, so perhaps it isn't surprising he's having trouble with some traditional Republican bases. Another thing I must admit I'm surprised at, I thought with the unpopularity of the two major party candidates, I was expecting Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, to make a very strong move, especially when he was able to get William Weld as his vice presidential candidate. Unfortunately, the Johnson-Weld ticket really has not caught much in the way of traction, but I really thought that was going to be a factor in the race, but it really hasn't.
And for those, just William Weld was a Republican governor of Massachusetts. So one thing about the Libertarian Party is they got a lot of true believers. They always nominate someone. They usually get about 1% of the vote, something like that. But they've got two quality candidates here. Gary Johnson was the governor of New Mexico, right?
Yes.
And William Weld, a Republican governor, and now a Libertarian, and William Weld. So you had, as Professor Cox was pointing out, two people with good political experience. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and two who 10 years ago were considered mainstream Republicans.
Yeah.
And both were Republican governors in states that were predominantly majority Democrat. So
New Mexico a little less so, but
yeah.
Two states that had very strong Democratic traditions.
So I was kind of surprised that they didn't make a stronger run.
Okay, let me make a couple of points, and I'm interested in receiving your questions and your inquiries about where we're going, because we want to be helpful to you as much as we possibly can. Let me make this point. In terms of political scientists, we don't know much more than you do in many occasions, given this current electoral process. And it will shake up the discipline, it will shake up the profession to a great extent. Some of the previous terminology and a lot of the insights and observations from past elections, as Jill alluded to, are probably going to change for a variety of reasons. And so I think both political parties, too, as well, will also be in the process of changing. Neither the Democrats or the Republicans picked up on the tremendous impact of populism, the recession of 2008, and a whole variety of other things that are happening. I would just kind of piggyback on that and say this. Given where the world is in terms of technology, neither candidate has the answer or answers for all of this. I mean, we're in something kind of like, and some of you may not understand this, but a change from the agricultural, revolution to the industrial revolution is what we're talking about here in many ways. Some big things are happening, and the kind of solutions that the candidates are talking about are really short-term and don't take into consideration a lot of these things. But they have to appeal to people who don't have jobs. They have to appeal to people basically who really have difficulty in understanding, what Wall Street is doing and how they're being basically discriminated against in a variety of different ways, economic, social, racial, ethnical, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of possibilities for research and a lot of possibilities for insightful observations after this is all done. So don't just turn to political science for the answers, because we just don't have them all.
I don't have an opinion.
Doesn't have an opinion.
There you go, technology.
Technology does not have an opinion on something?
Right, but it has a big impact. One of the other things, I'll move up to 32,000 feet here, is democracy. Probably the results of this election have more implications for democracy than a lot of previous elections. I won't say all, but a lot of previous elections. One of the primary ones, just to drill down real quickly, is for the media. For those of you that are, frequently chastising the media for bias, for lack of information, for journalistic inaccuracies and errors, that's okay. But the Founding Fathers truly believed that in terms of accessibility and accountability, the media played a very important role, often called the fourth estate. I mean, you've got the executive branch, and you've got the judicial branch, and you've got the legislative branch. And those are fine, but that fourth estate was put in there to hold politicians and government accountable. Americans have a love-hate relationship with government, mostly hate, but at the same time, the Founding Fathers believed very much that government had to be held accountable. And the press, the media largely put, was the way of doing that. All of you, I think, have sort of sensed what Donald Trump is doing in terms of playing on that hate for the media in a variety of different ways. But the media plays a very important and substantial role in making democracy work, and that will have to be looked at again. Not that anybody has the answer for this one either. The media is going through its own transformation with regard to seeking a new business model for how they have to do two things. They have to be civic-minded and they have to be profit-minded. Balancing those two things off, civic-mindedness and profit-mindedness, is not always an easy thing. And you know how they do that in terms of the hang and hold stuff. On the evening news, you hear about an automobile accident, or you hear about a terrorist attack or whatever, and then they grab you, and then they try to hold on to you with entertainment and a variety of other things, which is a minor change in terms of how the media operates, but it's very important in terms of how democracy operates, because I'm not sure it's doing the best job it can for democracy at this point in time. But certainly our candidates are not helping out, and Donald is doing a terrible job in terms of responsibility of making that fourth arm of government work, so to speak. Another thing that I think maybe this might be of interest to you is election reform. Our electoral process, many of you know, I'm sure, has this dominant feature which is called the Electoral College. That's gone through, in fact, I was an advisee for a fellow at Purdue University, Ken Kaufmeal, who has a number of books on the reform of the Electoral College and was Birch Bayh's former senator from Indiana, his primary advisor for a period of time. The point of all of this, and I don't just want to drop names, the point of this is there's a lot of research that's out there about reform of the Electoral College. But remember, the Electoral College is only going to be reformed when Congress wants to do so, or else the states have to put together an amendment process, which is unlikely as well. So you're not going to get a lot of change out of the Electoral College. But there's more than just that. There's the debate. The debates themselves, given the age that we're in, where the information commons is gone and other things are happening, the electoral process depends upon technology and audience participation in a way that it never has in the past. There's probably a whole variety of proposals and reforms for audience participation in debates that are out there right now. At the end of this electoral process, those changes and reforms will come into play in a way they have not in the past. So I urge you that if you're interested in that kind of thing, research it, take a look at it, and provide input wherever you can. There's blogs out there right now where you can provide input for reform of the electoral process. And I could go through a whole one. How many of you know who Sheryl Crow is? Okay. Sheryl Crow's been around for a while. She's probably of my age or close to it. The point is she's asking for shorter electoral periods of time, processes. So instead of starting 356 days out, you'd only start 90 days out, or 10 weeks out, as they do in Great Britain and a number of places. I'm sure the American public, generally speaking, would like to see some of that, a shorter process. That's another reform that's out there hanging around, waiting to be put into play. When I say put into play, I mean discussed, not necessarily that they're going to be implemented at this point in time. So a look at the electoral process. The other thing that I can point out in terms of my own background is international. You've got a lot of countries out there, major countries, that are just hanging on edge with regard to the outcome of this electoral process. Because of Fort Hays State University and because of my previous position, I've traveled to Turkey 6 times, to China about 8 times, and a variety of other places. I can't remember ever on one of those trips one of the people that I've met with not asking in some fashion about where the United States is with regard to its electoral processes, with regard if an election was going on, with regard to what was happening. I mean, George Bush was looked at as a cowboy, simply put. And again, not dropping names, but I do remember meeting with the Minister of Education in Turkey and basically being lectured for the first 20 minutes about what was happening in the United States back in 2008, 2009, and, excuse me, 2007, 2008, and being basically put back before I could ever get to my business. So internationally, we're looking, if you look at, if Hillary Clinton's elected, you're probably going to remain a focus on the Atlantic, as she might be called an Atlanticist, a person who's interested in Europe and those places that are very concerned right now with regard to Donald Trump and what he's doing in terms of the information he's putting out there about, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and a number of historical alliances and historical contacts and engagements that the United States has had with other countries around the world, but especially the Atlantic region. Donald Trump thinks he's an expert on Chinese currency, so you're probably going, I'm just using that as a lead-in, he's probably going to be talking about, China and moving toward South Asia politics in terms of foreign policy. There's going to be a lot more focus. There's going to have to be no matter who the next president is. But I'm suggesting to you that he thinks he knows more about that part of the world than he does about NATO, although he says plenty about NATO as well. So you're probably going to see some things happening internationally with regard to the countries out there in terms of how they relate to the United States, depending on who's elected president. I will stop there, and whatever questions, comments, observations you have, please share them with us.
So I have a question. What states do you think are going to come into play this election? Like, which states do you think are like the major ones that we should be watching, like election night?
Well, what I said, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Arizona, Nevada.
Pennsylvania.
Maybe Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's a great tease to the Republican Party, right? It's the girl that looks at, bats her eyelashes, and the Republicans think they're going to go home with her, and she never does. Yes, they always hope to make it. Pennsylvania hasn't gone for a Republican since 1988. Okay, when were you guys born, by the way? That's right. So in your lifetime, Pennsylvania's never gone for the Republicans. But they always hope, because the poll numbers look good, at least initially. But then it doesn't. Like, for instance, this poll this morning came out that Hillary's up by 11 in Pennsylvania. But yeah, but yes, the Republicans always hope to make that one. Michigan's another one they always hope to make competitive. Of those states, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, and Iowa are the most competitive, and to a lesser degree Nevada. Pennsylvania is less so, as I said. So that's what I would be looking for election night. I'm trying to think of any others.
The two states that are of interest to me, there's a lot of states of interest to me, but I have a second home in Florida, so I kind of feel I have a sense of where Florida has been and where it's going. And I have friends down there that text me on a regular basis and send me articles and news and all the rest. Florida's a real critical state for Trump. I mean, if Florida shuts down early, then you might as well just, although Pensacola in the west part of the state obviously is going to be a little bit later. I don't see how Trump has any pathway to 270, which is the number you need for the Electoral College, unless Florida goes in his direction. And Florida has a lot of old white people. We focus on Miami and the Hispanic communities and all the rest, but there's a lot of retirees, not only from Florida, but from Canada and Great Britain that now reside, in Florida. And Florida has some difficulty with, it's about 20 million. I think it's the third most populous state in the country right now. It's getting there shortly if it hasn't got there already. But the point is, if you look at the voting lines, I mean, they're just terrible. A lot of people give up. So the turnout in Florida is going to be very important. The other state which is of interest right now, and it's intriguing, is Utah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Utah's got to be intriguing because if a Republican doesn't win Utah, you might as well just about shut the lights out because it's heavily Republican and for a variety of other reasons, as Joe's pointed out. It's gone Republican for election after election, but right now there's Evan McCulloch, who's a third-party candidate, who's kind of split the vote. It's really like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in Utah at this point in time. And Evan has a chance of taking, was it 6 votes?
Six.
I think, away from Trump, which is not a good thing, because even if we were to get the 265, which some people have him at this point in time, that's real optimistic. Those six votes are probably going to become very, very critical. So Utah is an interesting state as well. If any of those traditional states, you know, that have gone Republican. If South Carolina goes Democrat, you better shut the lights out as well. I mean, those are just absolutely essential states for any Republican to win. And so looking at those, it's not so much the states that go, you know, for him that are battleground states, in my estimation, it's those states that are traditionally Republican. If you can't take them, nobody else will take them.
But I also want to give you a little hint too, and I was trying to give you a hint, like a timing. Again, if Indiana's going to go for him, but these poll watchers for the networks kind of look at key precincts, and they don't send the word up to call a state, because they call states before all the votes are counted. But they're looking for things that are not traditional. If they begin to see some worrying signs, right? So if they don't call, they're going to call Indiana at some point, maybe very early for Trump. But if they wait a little while, that means something's wrong, even though he ends up the night winning it, right? Like a state I would look for early on is Georgia, right? And of course, there was some talk that Hillary might be able to kind of steal that one. It's a traditional red state. That kind of faded after this month. There was some notion early in the month, early last month, I should say now, where she was getting pretty close. Again, I'm not thinking that if they call for Hillary, the night's over. But if they keep it blank on the map for a long time, that's a bad sign for Trump. Even if it ultimately goes for him, you know, because again, they're seeing results that look a little tighter than expected. So it's kind of similar to what you were talking about with Utah, although Utah's just further west, so it'll be later in the night. But it's the same kind of thing.
In regards to election reform, I remember hearing come up on at least one occasion something about first-past-the-post voting, and I was wondering if you knew what that was about, might be about.
What's it called again?
Firstpastthepost?
Yes. In regards to, never mind then.
No, it's.
Like, if you know what that might
Well,
be
the only thing I think
about.
of is that we have.
How about everybody Google it, see? Then you tell us.
The guy who brought it up was like a CGP gray or something.
Well, the only thing I know, you know, we have our system is for voting for any office, any electoral colleges. Whoever gets the most votes gets the electoral votes or gets the office. Okay? Except for the case of Louisiana, right, which they have a runoff election.
Yeah, well, Louisiana, California, and one
Georgia
other state.
state.
Yeah, so Louisiana, California, and I can't remember those, but the third state that has basically top two, where you have a primary where you have a whole bunch of candidates, and whoever are the top two finishers then go against each other. You could have two Democrats against each other, two Republicans, or two Libertarians against each other, and that's the way it works in Louisiana.
Yeah, and so what that means, for instance, if you have a third candidate, so I'm the Republican, I get 45% of the vote, and Leland's the Democrat, he gets 40% of the vote, and poor old Larry here's the third party candidate, gets 15% of the vote. In most states, I win, right? That's all. That's why I have heard the phrase first past the post, and the same thing happens with electoral college votes, right? If I get 45% of the vote, then my electors win, you know. But Louisiana and others have this have a runoff process, so that may be what your friend was talking about.
I think
That's in the
that
primaries of the
probably
general
is-
election.
I don't know, maybe.
So yeah, and you could get rid of that. You could, for instance, require runoff elections to force a second round. That way that someone at the end of the day has got the majority of the votes. Because imagine, let's take Utah for instance. All right, the electoral votes are going to be, oh, our friend Champ Rappaway. Utah could very well go for Mullen, or it could go for the Democrat or Republican. But no, it's unlikely anyone will get the majority.
I suppose that sounds like it would be something very good for third parties.
It would.
That way,
Well, no, but maybe not. I'm not sure what help third parties not.
because you could vote for a third party without worrying about wasting your vote.
Okay, and then you get more detailed. Reforms might require. Oh, well, okay.
It's simple majority winner.
Right. Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
Do you ever chaise along why we have two parties?
Well, I don't. That doesn't necessarily talk about. He just wanted to know what it might affect, and that's kind of what we're talking about. The fact that it forces you to get a majority.
I'm going to say something that's going to seem really inflammatory and terrible, so stay with me, because it'll be fun. When Donald Trump says the system is rigged, he's right. It's rigged in favor of the two-party system. It's rigged in favor of Democrats and Republicans. Because the first-past-the-post single-member district system, and Maurice Duverger, the great political scientist and historian, first quoted this term, that any system that has first-past-the-post elections and single-member districts will eventually become a two-party system, simply because strategic voting will require that. So, in a sense, Trump is right. Not about the direction in which the system is rigged, but that there is a rigging to the system, because no rule is neutral. So if you're always going to rig a system. All you're doing is changing the rules, and you're changing the winners and losers accordingly.
And of course, he's a Republican nominee, so he's a beneficiary actually of a two-party system in a way.
Without a doubt, yeah, because he's not Evan McMullin, he's not Jill Stein, he's not Gary Johnson. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Get him to admit that one.
Do we have other questions? Yes.
Kind of a two-part question. If you're comfortable like sharing your opinion in terms of international relations, which candidate do you believe would be the most beneficial for our country at this point in time?
We'll get into our partisanship. Larry knows more about international relations. I will just say this: taking them both at face value, Hillary's going to represent more traditional results. So, and Trump is a wild card. Like in so many things that Trump, he'll be more of a wild card. He has talked about getting out of NATO, or just changing NATO. He's talked about a much more aggressive, he's not really an isolationist, but a much more aggressive foreign policy, but also not getting involved. But then when we get involved, like bombing the heck out of things. All right. He obviously has a different relationship with Russia, the whole story onto itself. Hillary would give you what we've had, with obviously changes. Trump would be a shot in the dark, a throw of the dice, whatever metaphor you want. I don't know, that's my opinion. I don't know.
I'd just say he's uninformed. I mean, I said this earlier with regard to people that I've met in various places, whether it be Turkey or China or Saudi Arabia or whatever. I mean, he's just so inconsistent, uninformed about international relations or foreign policy. Just in general, they're afraid. I mean, they really don't know what he would do. And I think, you know, there ought to be about 350 million Americans that ought to say the same thing. He doesn't know what he ought to do, but that's another thing going on. It has to do with insecurity, it has to do with narcissism, it has to do with a whole variety of things. And I'm not going to do a psychological analysis, but I can say to you, what do you do when you run into a person who constantly flails her arms and says different kinds of things all the time? You generally get a little bit nervous, and you don't know what's happening. Certainly he represents change, as Joe is pointing out, but in terms of knowledge, experience, energy, or whatever, I do think that, you know, Hillary represents a better choice with regard to global affairs. You can have another opinion on it, but I do think if you're talking about, if you're asking at least about people out there, they're nervous.
I want to pick up something that Larry said earlier about reforms to the system. Reforms to the system come kind of at two levels, or at least two levels. One is reforming like the Electoral College you were talking about. We could also talk about just reforming Firstpastthepost or something like that. Some of this might require significant constitutional changes, but the parties could be reforming themselves. All right, and that's not something that the Constitution. That's just the parties changing their rules. Now, and for instance, both parties are going to be looking at this. All right, the Democrats, Bernie Sanders and company, who challenged Hillary and did a surprisingly good job, objected a lot to superdelegates. Now, he would have still lost the nomination without superdelegates, but nonetheless, it was a factor. I see the Democrats looking at reform to get rid of the superdelegates or decreasing their power. The Republicans face a more interesting set of things. Maybe they're going to add superdelegates or something like that. So the establishment clearly the Republican establishment did not want Trump, and they're worried about how to stop another Trump, either Trump himself in 2020, which I've heard a little bit of talk about, assuming he doesn't win. Or our Trump-like candidate. So we'll see that. And whichever party loses, okay, in any election, faces some soul searching, and they tinker or do major surgery with their nomination process typically. I think if the Democrats lose, they will face that because all losing parties do that. The Republicans, though, if they lose, are facing possible civil war. Okay, they're going to have even a more intense version of soul searching, and it'll be about the structure of the nomination process. I mean, back me up, Chad, do you think that's the case?
I wholeheartedly agree.
But they also have
saying
the
here like a
ideology.
bobblehead. Like yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And also,
yes.
the ideology question. Of course, you can't manage ideology, but what does the Republican ideology look like? Trump is not a conservative. He's not a liberal. I don't know what he is. He's
Whatever works.
Yeah, whatever works, whatever Trump believes in. And he's a kind of populist, but that doesn't really explain what he believes on the issues. I mean, yes, the only thing he's consistent about is some kind of immigration, nationalism, what do you want to call it. Besides that, day to day, he doesn't look like a traditional Republican ideologically. He's not a conservative.
And something.
Or if he is, he just adopted that recently. You know.
And something needs to be pointed out on what you were talking about there. After the 2012 election, the Republican Party did its quote, autopsy, and their conclusion was that they needed to become more inclusive. And believe it or not, if you go back to the days of Ronald Reagan, the Republicans used to be very competitive for the Hispanic vote, and you go back to the 80s, the Republicans were actually ahead of the Democrats at the time on gay rights. Okay, but of course that all changed in the 90s and the early 2000s, and so the 2012 autopsy was saying, hey, you need to go back to a more inclusive party like there was under Ronald Reagan, and somehow the new rules wound up nominating Trump. So I mean, it's like, you know, the rules did not produce the kind of candidate they were intended to produce. So, I mean, I don't know what to do, what to recommend when you try to do one thing and you get the exact opposite result of what you intended. I mean,
I think there's an Einstein quote about that.
What?
That's the definition of insanity.
Well, you definitely don't do the same thing over again. Yeah, but again, it's like you try to reform to get, a more inclusive party, and you wind up actually going away from that.
No.
So, how do you then?
Just 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, George W. Bush got 40% of the Hispanic vote.
Yes.
Republicans have a path to get it, but here's the scary thing: Republican has Trump done so much damage that even if a future Republican candidate says nice things to Hispanics, right? Do they just stop trusting that person? Republican Party used to be very competitive in California, and Governor Wilson ran a much less intense anti-immigration policy, much not rhetorically bad, but a tough set of policies about immigration. And that really hurt the Republican brand in California in some sense for a whole generation.
Turned it blue.
Yeah, and so, can you get those voters? Because I got to tell you, Democrats were scared after Bush, right? If the Republicans get 40, they don't even get a majority, just get 40%. And the Democrats have the narrow path to victory in a lot of elections then.
What these guys are really saying for all you millennials, now's the time. I mean, whether you want to capture the Republican Party or start a third party or do something else, there's an opportune time to make a difference, is what it comes down to in American politics in a way you've never had before. I don't think so anyway. I may be wrong. You could look back to George Wallace and a few other folks, and what do we say, Ross Perot. But I think really for people that are, in that age group at this point in time, if you pay attention and you have a little bit of energy and activity, you can really make a difference, but we'll see. I just offer this larger observation about where we are. As a guy who's been an educator his whole life, and education has been a career for me and all the rest, I also have an insatiable intellectual curiosity about the world, and so I tend to admire people who are careful thinkers, to use that terminology. Certainly Donald Trump is not a careful thinker, but I do have respect for Trump in this sense that he's made people think. He's been provocative. I don't want him to be president of the United States, simply put, but he has taken a hold of change in a way a lot of other folks have not. The tail end of change is being dragged through the mud, dragging people through the mud and a whole variety of things, which are not admirable at all. But give Trump credit, even though he may have stumbled into it. You don't have a grand strategy up there at the top of the Trump Tower, and sometimes the window's open and folks are ready to jump out. But at the same time, he's really stoked the fires of people thinking carefully about where we are with all these topics, whether it be election change or democracy and a lot of things. That's pretty important for us to take advantage of at this point in time. So there's an opportunity that hasn't been there for people to really move and make a real difference. So I don't want a Trump president, but at the same time, I think what he's done has been adequate to a degree.
I think I'd like to add to what you said is that, and this is something Dr. Ragway's coming out, but Trump is a result of a long process of de-emphasizing the importance of political parties, okay? That the parties have had less and less control over who their nominee is, and is this a good thing or a bad thing? And also, is this the new normal, that you're going to have candidates who, for example, I mean, Bernie Sanders wasn't even a registered Democrat, and he made a very strong run at the Democratic nomination, and Trump, most of his life, to my knowledge, was a Democrat, and he got the Republican nomination. And I mean, is this going to be the new normal where it's just individuals and the parties are just sort of something in the background, or is could the parties reassert themselves?
I'll take that on because that's part of a lot of what my research is involved with. And we have managed to turn political parties into shells of their former selves. And if you think, let me give you a great example of this. Right after the Billy Bush video went viral with Trump, my Twitter timeline was populated entirely by people saying the GOP has to dump Trump. They've just got to get rid of him. They got to wipe him off the ballot. And I was reminded of, I think it was a Geico ad about 2-3 years ago, where a woman has printed out all these vacation pictures. She says, I'm saving so much time sending these pictures to my friends by putting them on my wall, imputing that it's her Facebook wall, but she's actually putting them on the wall of her house. And her friend says, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. And that's it. The parties can do nothing. They are hamstrung by the primary electoral system, where less than 10% of the eligible voting population goes out and chose, combined 10%, chose Trump and chose Clinton. Incredibly unrepresentative of only the most extreme viewpoints in each party. And in fact, the primary system is so bad that it's allowed outside interests, more extreme in their nature, to hijack the entire political party nomination process. We have destroyed American political parties, destroyed them. They're meaningless because they can do nothing now. How terrible is it that these things that we look to as information shortcuts, you look to a Republican nominee and you expect policies X, Y, and Z, ideological orientation A. You look to a Democrat and you expect ideological orientation B, policies D, E, and F. And the primary system allows entrepreneurial candidates like Trump to go in there, steal their party's, or steal a party's nomination. And that's why you're seeing so much discord within the GOP. Why really high-ranking officials within the GOP, like Patrick Ruffini, like Rick Wilson, and so on, these are the folks who started Never Trump. It wasn't Bernie bros. It wasn't folks shilling for Hillary Clinton. It was Republicans, because he hijacked their party. We've killed our parties with our primary system, and it is time we recognize the direct primary as the failure that it is.
That's if you want to say
Yeah. But political parties are the best linkage institution.
But the Founding Fathers says from 1789 to 1800, right? You're going to hear this tonight from Ed Larson. We don't want political parties. By 1800, we already had political parties, and ever since. So as Chap is pointing out rightly so, I mean, these are information shortcuts.
And famous political scientist, I forget who it was, said, was it B.O.K., no parties, no democracy.
Right.
And I think I've told some of you in my classes, just was as the Eastern Europe communism Soviet collapsed, like one of these medium-level dissidents who is now moving into government in Poland, not one of the super famous ones, but a moderately important person, came to visit one of my graduate seminars. And we were such nerdy people. He asked, how do we create democracy in our country? We want democracy. And he said, and the professor brought this guy in, and we all raising our hands. We're talking about the constitutions and stuff like that. And he just shook his head after we shared all this stuff about constitutions. So my feeling is that's not it. We want to figure out parties. We want to figure out how to make parties work. You guys don't realize that parties would make. And of course, he was talking about after. He wasn't worried about primaries yet, but he was talking about the important parties are the, as Chap said, I agree 100%, are these great linkages or institutions. Now, by the way, in case you were wondering, and I'm just going to follow up, Chap, on what your comment was. The old days, party elected officials, party bosses, selected nominees. They selected horrible people like Dwight Eisenhower and Franklin Roosevelt.
John F. Kennedy.
And John F. Kennedy and Woodrow Wilson.
And Theodore Roosevelt.
And Theodore Roosevelt. These awful presidents. Okay? And furthermore, you know, maybe if then the parties perform themselves, first the Democrats, Republicans followed suit with really, primaries have been around for a long time, but really making the whole system primary-centric. Right? Now, it might be a different thing if it actually turned out that we got huge turnout. But you might say, well, I don't like the idea of party elite societies. But we traded a narrow elite who knew about politics and produced a lot of mainstream Republicans and Democrats and sensible candidates and sensible presidents in return for just a tad more participation. It would be an interesting argument if turnout was 30 or 40% and we got more representation. What Chap is getting at is now parties are easily captured by anyone. Trump was a Democrat for much of his career, but largely because he was in New York. New York's a Democratic state, right? He's not really any political party. I mean, except he captured Republicans. And Bernie, as Leland said, he caucused with Democrats, but he doesn't remember the Democratic Party until just before the primary started. We could have had Bernie versus Trump and have two people who weren't really representing anything of the major parties, you know. And so I agree wholeheartedly with it. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to go back to the party of old. But this system is not working. And whatever it is, in my opinion, we need to do something different.
If we can't go back to the old system, it's because we won't accept it, because every other functioning democracy in the world lets primaries nominate their own candidates. Every other functioning republic, I should say.
We don't have lots of primaries. You mean they allow?
They have no primaries.
They have no primaries, right?
Yeah.
So you misspoke something. They don't use a primary system like we do. And so, yeah. I don't know how to try to create the old system. Ideally, we'd want the old system without some of the corruption involved. I think that's possibly doable.
So the answer is simple. If you want to make America great again, create a new political party. I'm kidding.
Why not? You know what? In many ways, this Republican Party looks like the Whigs of the 1850s. And they don't have a handle on what their identity of their party is. So they nominated the war hero of the day, a reality TV host.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation.
But the decline continues, and it's going to take some kind of ideological entrepreneur, and I think the building blocks of it are here. A younger person who is more socially liberal, but still economically conservative, comes in and can revitalize it or start a brand new party that's going to rally people and either will take over the Republicans or destroy it and replace it with this new entity.
I think that's a very powerful not a full-scale libertarian, but a libertarian-minded person who was socially. I'm just backing up with Professor DMAC.
Yeah, again, that's why I was very surprised that Gary Johnson and William Weldon.
Well, he chose a third-party route, which is it's funny. What we have is a system that will not allow for a third party, but has two dysfunctional major parties. Right? And that's really the worst of all possible worlds. The Republicans are more dysfunctional. And although I think Hillary's going to win, and I think that will put less pressure on the Democrats to do reform. As I was saying a little earlier, that whatever party loses goes through the soul searching. You said autopsy. I tried to use the word soul searching.
Well, that was the term that
they used. The dominant party then will the winning party will put off any soul searching, which means actually, as painful as it is, if the Republicans lose, they may be in a better, if they can figure out a better spot. The Democrats will simply paper over what the problems they have probably, and figuring, well, we got the win, why change too much? And Hillary as president will have no incentive to change anything because the system produced her as painful as it was at times, right?
In that way, it's an analog to the '88 election. The third straight election where Republicans won, but they were kind of
Yes.
They were kind of losing their way. Democrats were in full dysfunction at that point, but then they started getting themselves together. They reinvented themselves as the party of Clinton Gore, the double Bubba strategy, a little bit more centrist. And they came around and won in 1992, taking advantage of the fact that Republicans were saying, hey, everything is working for us, we're afraid to change anything and adapt with the times. And eventually the times changed in ways that they couldn't adapt to.
The victory disease, as the Japanese called it during World War II.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Japanese were on a big winning streak during World War II, and then they
You
started
get
losing.
so focused
Complacent.
on just keeping what you have, you're not thinking about changing to expand. Larry wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna urge the audience and maybe ourselves as well. Be careful about this historical legacy that we have here. Ideological kinds of factors, natural terms like Republican and Democrat and all the rest. I mean, when you come right down to it, business people tend to have this as a natural instinct. Most do, let's put it this way. And people that are curious do. I mean, business models are about creating value and capturing value. Personally, I think both political parties need to start with that dictum, basically. How do you create and capture value? I mean, look at it this way. Hispanics are valuable to the next political party, whatever it is, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, you name it. Probably none of those names are appropriate. Blacks are of value. And I'm trying not to be objectify here, basically commoditize, or basically, monetize the electoral process. But you really have to start with this basic principle where you're gonna how do I create value for my party, and how do I get this person elected? What do I know? So you gotta start looking out there what is valuable. And then start with that and start to integrate. Now the Republicans tried that in 2012 and got so far down the road but got hijacked, as we've been pointing out. But that business model is extremely important, and I really don't think anybody's got a handle on it at this point in time. Young people are going to be of value. I mean, you go down the list here in terms of putting out your valuables and your assets and then say, okay, this is more important than this one, let's go this way. But anybody that starts a new political party or tries to reform an existing political party needs to start with that premise in mind and then work on down the road from there. And that will be the kind of, I think, analysis that allows you to think over the long term instead of just short term, because you're not just looking for the 2020 election, you're looking down the road in terms of trying to create something that's going to have lasting value, sustainability as we call it today in the world, in higher education and a variety of other places. So I think that's extremely important. And part of that is the media. We talked about the media earlier. The media has to look at it this way as well, and the media has to be brought into this asset process, because right now people are just scrambling and really don't know what to do. And we've changed. All of us up here know that. I'm sure you do too as well, many of you, that basically that information commons that used to be out there is just not out there. And people gather and select information in a whole different way than they used to. A lot of it created by machine intelligence, as Facebook will show you. If you got the right algorithm, you can do a lot of things. But people are going to catch on it.
Just to follow what you said, I think the important question would be to ask you guys in the audience, what could the people in the political process do to engage you and bring you into it? Because my impression is they've done a lot to turn you off. How could they actually get you engaged and get you involved in it?
No pressure, just solve the problems in our country.
Well, we're asking people who have come to a Times talk, so we're kind of preaching to the converted here.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, I think a better question to ask is, how tough do you want to be? Because I'm going to tell you something. So there's at least one of you who's probably going to say, all right, I will take up that mantle. I will take that charge upon myself, and I will try to be the change that I want to see. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen at the very least the first time. You're going to get the crap beaten out of you. You're going to get beat. You're going to get hit hard. Are you going to keep fighting? Because that first time through, it can completely turn you off. It's the people who keep fighting, who remain committed. They're the ones who eventually win. There are no instant wins.
Let me recommend a book to you. It's called Changing Minds. It's not a very good book. But, it's by Howard Gardner. But it goes, in terms of following on the chap's thread here, it kind of carries this forward, like, okay, you know, I'm informed, I know what's happening, I'm intelligent, blah, blah, blah. But that isn't what changes minds necessarily, thus the title of the book. There's a whole series of other things that Gardner points out in terms of how you change people's minds. Along with resilience, which is what Chap's talking about to some degree. You got to hang in there, and other things. And I know we're running out of time, so. But I'd suggest to you that the world is just not built upon being smarter than the other guy in the room. It's also built upon having tactics and strategy that help you change minds in a productive way, rather than.
And let me give a specific example. Right? Not about a new party, but Republican. We've seen sort of the end with Trump, of who doesn't believe in much anything besides Trump. I don't think he's conservative, but you know, the Republicans were a moderately conservative party, if you will, in the 1950s, and then this guy named Barry Goldwater came along, and was very traditionally conservative, and was really trying to push the Republican Party to be more consistent ideologically. They were inconsistently conservative, let's say. Right? And they got crushed in '64. Now there were a lot of reasons they got crushed. The late president being assassinated, but then they got Richard Nixon, right? Who wasn't really a super. He was conservative, but not super conservative.
He was a pragmatist.
He was pragmatist. And then eventually, a guy who cut his teeth on the Reagan Goldwater campaign, Ronald Reagan, got elected, and the Republican Party became a true conservative party, not super conservative, but a conservative party, right? And pretty consistent ideologically. Those people put through some very unsatisfying wins with Nixon and some horrible losses for more than a decade, close to almost 2 decades, until they finally got what they wanted. And so I'm with Professor Rackling, you know, perseverance here. You know, they faced a lot of, as I say, either defeats or very unsatisfying victories. And in a sense, they really weren't huge fans of Nixon, but they kept plugging away at it. And they true conservatives started capturing school boards and local level offices and then state level offices. Reagan became governor of California. And then eventually they captured the Republican Party. So there is a precedent for what Professor Rackaway is talking about that's very real. So if you guys want, I'm just guessing, your generation is kind of libertarian in a way that Professor, you were talking about, socially liberal but fiscally conservative.
Say more left libertarian, but yeah.
Yeah, slightly more left. But there's
we're both within the same ballpark.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to say is I don't know which party, but let's say take up the remnants of the Republican Party, assuming they lose, right?
It's the easy get.
It's the easy get, but you may not get what you want.
Yeah.
Tolerate some defeats and some tough battles. And I know this is hard for you guys, but then wait till you're 40 or 45. I know it's a long time away, and all of a sudden you will come into the promised land. All right.
On the other hand, Republicans are doing great at the state level.
Yeah, they are actually.
This democracy has done really, really well for 200 years with forced compromise, where not everyone gets exactly what they want, but everyone gets a little chunk of something. And somehow in the last 20 years, and a lot of it is I chalk up to the evolution of the primary, we lost sight of that. And then we believe that bipartisanship is the other guy's doing what I want them to do. We can't sustain like that. We have to recognize the failure within that orientation and change it, regardless of what party, regardless of what generation, regardless of what ideological orientation we have, or we will fail, because we have to recognize we don't get everything we want right now. That's not how any of this works.
I think Megan's trying to create change.
Disruption!
This is the perfect time to stop. Thank you guys for all coming today, and let's give our panelists a round of applause real quick. If you